Hey, what's going on, guys? Will here. I hope you all are doing well in these crazy times. What I'm going to be covering today is going to be 5 things that you guys should be thinking about before you go out in the water, and let's go ahead and get into it. Now, if you guys watched last week's video, that was going to be my last video of me out on the water down in Florida. It was a really hard video for me to put together, but I'm excited for the comments you guys have been sharing and on the YouTube page here, as well as on my Instagram and Facebook. So it's great to have that community there. I've been kind of noticing in kind of the general realm of YouTube and Hobie Adventure Islands and small boat sailing, kayaking, there's a bit of a lack of information on the kind of small boat camping side, especially for the Hobie Mirage Adventure Islands. And so I want to help fill some of that gap. So if that's something you guys are interested in, stick around for a few more videos that I've got coming up in the next couple of weeks. And I'm definitely going to be covering more of that. I do have a couple of other videos that I've already posted that kind of go lightly into how I set up my tent on the boat, as well as some ways that I cook on the boat and ways that I sleep on the boat. So go ahead, check those videos out, and definitely keep updated for the videos that I have coming up. All right, so let's get into things. Number 1, first thing that you want to think about when going out on the water, and this goes for any kind of water, or really just outside in general, is the weather. Now, within weather, especially when you're going out on the water, there are 3 things to keep in mind. The first thing you need to think about with weather is precipitation. Is it gonna rain? Is it gonna thunderstorm? Those are things that you can look at ahead of time, but it's also important to look multiple days ahead of time, as well as then monitor it as you get closer. It might look like it rained 3 days from now, but when you actually get to that day, it may rain more or it may rain less. The second thing is temperature. So not only what the air temperature is gonna be, but also if you're going out on the water, what is the water temperature? Because it might be warm outside, but the water might be really cold. A general rule of thumb to think about is the 100 rule. So you take the air temperature, you take the water temperature, and you add it together. If it's more than 100 degrees, you're probably good to go out on the water. Definitely still be advised of what the air temperature is, the water temperature. Even at 50-50 split, 50 degrees outside, 50 degrees water, that is a high risk for hypothermia. But definitely if you are below that 100-degree mark, you really need to think about safety precautions going out on the water, whether that's layers, extra warm liquids like coffee or tea, or just even hot water, or even a dry suit. And the third thing is wind direction. So even if you're not sailing, wind direction can be really important to how well you go out on the water. Because if you're fighting the wind the whole time, that's going to be really exhausting for both getting out as well as getting back. Within wind, there's a few different things you can look at. You can look at the wind direction, you can look at the wind velocity, but then also a third thing called the gust differential. So you can have what the steady wind is at, but also what is it gusting to? What is that higher number? And it's oftentimes more dangerous to have that larger number. So you might have a lower wind at like 5 miles an hour, but if it's gusting all the way up to 15, then that has a gust differential of 10 miles an hour. Which means that it could be nice and easy 5 miles an hour, and then you could get slammed with a 15-mile-an-hour wind out of nowhere, and that could be a real issue, especially if you have a sailboat. So, within weather, 3 things to keep in mind: precipitation, temperature, and wind. Let's get on to number 2. Alright, so number 2. This one tends to pertain to coastal areas, so the ICW, the Intercoastal Waterway, and the ocean is the tide. So the tide is that constant rising and falling of the water across the day, and you can have usually 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day, but it can vary. And the varying is where you need to look up your tide charts. You need to figure out when is it high tide in your area, when is it low tide in your area. Because you can get caught in the current going the opposite direction, and that will be really hard to boat against. But then on top of that, you also have to think about how much your tidal difference is. How far is it from low tide to high tide? And that ranges greatly where you are. So where I started down in Miami, Florida, the tidal range was a foot, 12 inches. That was it, between low tide and high tide. But as you move up the coast, when you get towards the Georgia area, you end up in the Georgia Bight, which can have a tidal range of 6 to 9 feet and sometimes even higher. And when it gets higher is something else you have to keep in mind called a spring tide. Now the spring tide is basically when you have an extra high tide, and that happens usually twice a month during a full moon. Think of extra gravity pulling. And so some of those areas can push that high tide even a foot or two higher. So you have to think not only which way the tide is flowing, but also how much that difference is going to be for whether you're anchoring, or if the tidal range is larger, then that also means the flow of water is going to be higher. So in a coastal area, that's definitely something you got to think about. And you're probably already thinking about if you live out and boat on the coast regularly. But if it's your first time boating out on the coast, definitely want to check your local tide charts. All right, let's move on to number 3. This is really, really important, especially if you're going out for a longer day on the water, is your food and your water. Those are really important because if you get stuck out on the water, especially without water, you end up dehydrated, and when you're dehydrated, you don't make smart decisions. So how much water should you carry? I tend to say at least 1 to 2 Nalgene's per person. Now, depending on how long you're out, you might need to carry more. On top of that, if you're cooking meals, so if you're out for a full day or multiple days, you need to carry more water, because you'll be amazed at how much water you can use when you're cooking with a stove as well as cleaning up. So as reference for me, when I'm out on the water, I carry about 3 to 4 days of water, which equals about 3 gallons of water, which will cover all of my time out on the water that I'm just drinking, then all the water I use to cook with, and all the water I use to clean with. But then also for your kind of substance, your food, you can kind of break it down into your snacks and your meals. Now for snacks, for me out on the water, that's a lot of granola, that's a lot of pretzels, it's a lot of trail mix, things like that, really easy, high calorie intake. But then for meals, then you could have really easy things, instant rice, instant mashed potatoes. I do a lot of instant rice with a protein, so whether that's canned chicken or canned tuna or canned refried beans, things like that, to help with that calorie intake. You're constantly having to counteract for the surf, and so you're actually going to exhaust yourself a lot more than you may realize if you don't boat that often. So definitely want to keep in mind to have some food on board. Even if you're just going out for a few hours, bring some snacks and some water with you, just in case. Even if you don't use them, it's better to have it and not need it. All right, so that was number 3. Let's move on to number 4. All right, so number 4. Number 4 is all about navigation. Navigation is something that I think is really important that I don't think is talked about enough. And when I say navigation, I mean 3 different things. I mean map and compass, I mean a GPS, and also your navigational channel markers. Now, when I say map and compass, no, you probably don't need to have a physical map and compass on board with you. But it's good to check looking at your charts before you go out so that you know where you're going. And with those nautical charts, what they can show you is things like how deep the water is, where the channel is, where there are any obstructions. Because your boat has a draft, and with that draft, you may not be able to go in certain areas that you might be able to look like on the surface. Now, a lot of boats these days, especially your larger motor boats, have a lot of chart plotters on board, but for your smaller pleasure craft, they may not have a chart plotter, so it's good to look at those before you go out. But then on top of that, having a GPS on board can be really, really helpful. Now, most of us, we have our cell phones. Now, our cell phones can be really helpful. They're always in our pocket, and they have that GPS with them. But oftentimes I find, 1, phones aren't always waterproof, and 2, phone batteries die really easily. So if you want to take your phone out on the boat, that's totally fine. I highly recommend it even, but make sure you have a waterproof case for it and maybe even a battery pack to help charge it, because being out in the sun can definitely kill that battery. Now for me, what I use is I have a Garmin InReach Explorer Plus. Now you've seen this on my PFD when I'm out on the water all the time, and this has everything that I need on it. It's got GPS, it's got two-way satellite communication, it's even got a SOS switch on there. So it's really what I need, especially with me going out by myself in a state that I am not from, in waterways that I don't know. So this is really, really nice, especially if you're going out solo in an area you may not know very well. And the last part of navigation is channel markers. Now, you'll see on the Intercoastal Waterway, we have both those red and those green channel markers, and they run all the way up and down the coast. But on top of that, with the Intercoastal Waterway, they also have extra symbols on them of squares and triangles. If you see those on your channel markers, you know you're within the Intercoastal Waterway. On top of that, it's really helpful to know that the triangles will always be on the western side of the ICW, and the squares will always be on the eastern side. So if you're going from north to south, the triangles will always be on your right or starboard side, and the squares will always be on your left or port side. It's good to look at those numbers ahead of time so you can kind of figure out, plan your route in your mind, so that when you get out and you see those channel markers, you already have an idea of what you're looking at and where you are. There can be a ton of other really great videos out there talking more about navigation and navigational aids, and I really recommend going and checking those out, and I'll try and see if I can link a couple of them down in the description. But please go check those out. I can't tell you how many times that I went out and I just saw people ignoring channel markers and seeing people get stuck, and it just becomes a real safety hazard. It's really easy. Check it before you go, and then you don't have to worry about it when you're actually out on the water. That's navigation. Let's go ahead and move on to number 5. Now 5 probably should have been number 1 because it's probably the most important thing, and that is safety. Now when it comes to safety out on the water, there can be a whole bunch of different things to keep in mind, but I've tried to break it down into 4 things. First off is a first aid kit. Every boat should have a first aid kit on it. No matter what, no matter how small your boat is, how short of a time you're going out, have a first aid kit on board, and try and make it in a waterproof container, because it's always better to have it and not need it. In that container, or whenever you go out on the water, please bring sunscreen. I have seen so many sunburnt people out on the water, and when you're sunburnt, you're also very easily to get dehydrated, and that turns from a bad situation to worse really quickly. So sunscreen, first aid, please do it. After the first aid kit, you also want to think about having some of your other safety equipment. So like a PFD, personal flotation device. You may not have to wear it, but please have them on board in case you need them. Same with also having your light and sound producing equipment. Now a lot of this is all Coast Guard required, so you should have them on board anyway, but it's good to check them before you go out so that if they've been expired or they need replacing, or if you need to add more to it, if you have more people going with you than you normally do, it's good to check those before you go. Another piece of equipment that you'll always see on my life jacket or my PFD is this guy right here. Now this is the Standard Horizon Floating HX300. Now this is a marine radio that you can use for VHF, which stands for very high frequency, that I think every boater should have. And the reason I think every boater should have it is for, honestly, safety, because of Mayday calls. Now, Mayday is hopefully a call no boater ever wants to do, but in a pinch, it can save your life, literally. And so it can really be a lifesaver. And I've heard plenty of Mayday calls out on the water, and so they can definitely save you. Because I've also heard of kayakers who get stuck out by themselves, who don't have a radio, and that gets really bad really fast. But they can also be really helpful if you're out on the ICW, if you're trying to contact a bridge. If you're really tall and you're trying to get a bridge to open, they're only going to contact you best through a VHF radio. Now, you probably can call them, but it's definitely easier through your VHF radio. If you guys want to learn more about VHF radios, I'm going to try and link a video to those down as well. And the last thing that I always want to cover when we're talking about safety is a float plan. Now, a float plan is basically a plan or a schedule of what you're doing, where you're going, and when you plan on going back. It could be easy enough of, I'm leaving this marina at this time and I should be back by this time. That may be all you need. But if you want kind of more guidelines, the Coast Guard does produce a PDF that I'm going to try and link down to the description that you can use as well. That in there you can put your name, your boat model, boat color, boat name, emergency contact information, and it's a peace of mind. And with that peace of mind, you can basically go out on the water, and then if things were to go wrong and you're not able to contact anybody, at least somebody knows where you are, where you were going, and when you were supposed to be back. Now, the important thing, the caveat with this float plan is when you fill out that float plan, whether it's just a sticky note or you fill out the whole form or even just a text, send that to someone that's not on the boat. So you might be going with your family. Don't text your float plan to your significant other who's on the boat. That's not going to help. Send it to, say, your neighbor or your friend down the street or your boss or whoever. Send that to someone who's not on the boat. Doesn't do a whole lot of good if everyone who's on the boat are the only people who know where you're going. I wanted to make some recommendations for some of the information that I just talked about in terms of weather and tides and wind, things like that. In terms of weather, where I like to get a lot of my weather is just the weather app on my phone. So that could be anything from Weather Underground to the Weather Channel to WeatherBug. Any of those are really good. If you have your own local station, that's definitely going to be probably more accurate. In terms of wind, I like to use probably a couple of different sources. The one I usually immediately go to is one called iWindsurf, and that is for windsurfers, but if you're near the coast, it's really great. It has real-time wind mapping as well as really good hour-by-hour predictions for both the direction and the gust. Now, when it comes to tides, probably the best one I've found is called Tides Near Me. It's an app that you can either type in your location or you can just use your GPS location. And it will tell you at different inlets or different areas near you, it'll tell you where your tides are going to be, how high, how low, when they're going to be for the areas around you. And so I kind of use a combination of all these apps as I'm kind of lounging in my bed first thing in the morning. I'm checking all of these apps so I have a better idea of what I've got for the day ahead. And then I also look at just my maps, my Google Maps, and kind of plan out my route. But on top of that, with my Garmin InReach, it has its own companion app called EarthMate, and I've got my routes plotted in there. So I also take a look at that to know, all right, I'm going to this location and it's gonna be about this far, so I can kind of plan out my day of where I might stop and take a break or have a snack, or if I wanna make sure and stop a place. All these apps are really helpful to help make sure that you are well prepared out on the water, safe out on the water, which means that you can have a good time out on the water. All right, guys, that is my 5 things to keep in mind when going out on the Intercoastal Waterway. I hope you find it helpful. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button, as well as if you have any further questions or comments, make sure to leave them down in the comments so that everybody can learn from this experience, because I also say that I am fairly young when it comes to boaters, that there are boaters that have been out there for decades and they are way more experienced than me. But I just wanted to share what I've learned and what I can share. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll all get through this, and I'll see you guys out on the water.